My name is Zeyna Malik, and I'm a first year in Jonathan Edwards College studying history.
And my name is Esmé Talenfeld, also in Jonathan Edwards, and I am a first year prospective American Studies major. We're student guides at the Yale Center for British Art, and we're doing a virtual tour while the gallery is closed for renovation. However, we are very excited to be reopening in the spring of 2025.
As the title of this tour explains, for the next 20 to 30 minutes, we want to look at 4 works of art created in the late 18th century, inspired by Indian landscape, architecture, and customs, to understand the artistic environment of that particular moment in history, and subsequently gain insight into the cross-cultural exchange that was happening with Europe, and particularly with Britain in the Indian subcontinent during this period. We will be focusing on works by James Wales, Gangaram Chintaman Tambat, William and Thomas Daniel, and Balthasar Solvins. As you might have noticed, we will be discussing both European and Indian artists. The reason for this is that between the early 1600s, European and specifically British interest in India had been growing steadily, and merchants began arriving in the Indian subcontinent, initially with commercial interests for fruits, spices, cottons, silks, tea, opium, and more. The British East India Company soon emerged as a monopolistic trading body and was arguably one of the most dominant corporations in history. As the British began to integrate themselves into Indian society, the company soon became involved in politics. By 1858, the British Crown succeeded in the management of the Indian subcontinent. In this way, an international corporation was able to transform itself into a colonial power. The desire to gain knowledge about a foreign lifestyle, geography, and culture grew, not only because it would benefit the British in business, but also because of an increasing fascination with this radically different environment. This tour focuses on works on paper. We chose to highlight just a few pieces from the Yale Center for British Art's collection of works on paper, watercolors, prints, and drawings, as opposed to the paintings and sculptures that are more frequently displayed. So jumping into our first work, this image depicts a natural landscape. I want to first draw your attention to the artist's perspective here. We can easily define a distinct foreground, middle ground, and background here. So as you can see in the foreground, we see a large circle of rocks to the right of an elephant, disproportionately large, compared to the group of figures standing in the middle ground. The middle ground then leads our gaze to the background of the piece, with the elephant and trees framing the skyline in the shape of a V. In the middle ground, there seems to be a family dressed in formal Western clothes, and they are standing. Behind them are groups sitting down, and their clothes are less defined, but significantly more plain. One man is also propping up a small cart. Looking closely at the horizon line, the trees suggest that the background is not actually a developed city, but a natural landscape, even though the title of this works collection, 12 Views of the Island of Bombay and its Vicinity, might suggest that the city of Bombay, which is today called Mumbai, is depicted on the horizon line. This is a hand-colored etching which belongs to a larger collection called The 12 Views of Bombay. This is the 12th piece in the collection called View from the Island of Elephanta. So to place this on a map, Bombay, which is modern-day Mumbai, is on the western coast of India. Because of its geographical location, the city emerged as a major site of trading, specifically for seafaring merchants from Europe. These pieces were designed and engraved on site by British artist James Wales between the years 1791 and 1792. It was one of the many projects commissioned by a British diplomat named Sir Charles Warre Mallet, who served as a resident in the British East India Company. Mallet actually commissioned over 100 works on paper by British and Indian artists, which included extensive manuscript material and vivid sketches of landscape, architectural sites, scenes from everyday life, and diplomatic ceremonial events. Collectively, these works provided a unique window into central India at a critical historical moment. Returning to the title of the work, this piece was provisionally called Picturesque Prospects upon the Islands of Bombay, Salsette, and Elephanta. These two notions of picturesque and prospects put forward in the provisional title are important, since they offer a striking insight into Wales's intention when he created this work. A close look at the image reveals how, in it, Wales balances the romantic aesthetic of a visually attractive, picturesque scene with the imperial perspective of the prospect. The 18th century picturesque convention literally means to resemble a picture. As illustrated in Wales's piece, he organized landscapes into a clearly distinct foreground, middle, and background, with a roughness to the scene and trees framing the image. This convention made alien environments such as this one much more accessible to the viewers of the artwork in Britain. On the other hand, the idea of prospect implied a sense of surveillance and acknowledged the British East India Company's underlying economic and political purposes in producing these images. For the British, the acquisition of knowledge about a foreign territory was inextricably linked to political control. Warren Hastings, the Governor General of Bengal at the time, explicitly acknowledged this fact. He wrote, quote, "Every accumulation of knowledge, and especially such as it is obtained by social communication with people over whom we exercise a dominion founded on the right of conquest, is useful to the state." This demonstrates how paintings were created to educate those foreigners who wanted to understand the landscape as a means of increasing their control. In James Wales's proposition for this collection, the artist described the various views of the city he planned to publish. He wrote that, quote, "Groups of human figures, etc., will be introduced, illustrative of the manners and customs of the inhabitants, and the trees, plants, and shrubs, etc., in the foreground of these pictures will be characterized so as to please the eye of the botanist." So this idea of a view was also of key importance as a highly constructed image rather than an exact replication of a site. It purposefully incorporated certain details and omitted others to make the image appeal to a wide audience. Through prints such as these, Wales arguably sought to adapt the Indian landscape and cities to the view.
Moving on to our second work of art, this piece differs quite obviously from the last. We don't see any animals or figures, rather it focuses clearly on one large building. Looking at the sketch as a whole, the dashes of color in the sky and the ground and the backgrounded trees stand out from the gray monochromatic building. The style in which the sky is painted, with its harsh contrast and all too clear end, suggests that this painting is not an exact representation of reality. Rather, it is highly stylized. The unique perspective of the sky interacts with the almost two-dimensional, flattened perspective of the building, most obvious in the artist's inconsistent outlines and shadows. The distinct style is characterized by broad washes of color, dark, symmetrical outlines, and an immediate perspective of the artist's subject. Looking closely at the building, we can see multiple domes and highly ornate elements. For example, these engravings of animals on the side of the building. Each alternating animal appears to be an elephant, which provides context for the cultural importance of this building. Elephants are considered holy in Hinduism, and therefore it makes sense that this structure serves a religious purpose. This piece is titled Exterior View of Kailas. Kailas, also known as Kailasanta, is a temple at the Ellora Caves in India built in the 700s. The caves were recently granted UNESCO World Heritage Site status. And this temple is considered one of the most remarkable at Ellora because of its remarkable architectural intricacies, especially impressive given that the entire building was constructed from a single block of stone. Here is an image of Kailas, which shows not only its beauty, but emphasizes the stylistic differences between the actual temple and the artist's depiction of it. And to place this site in a geographical context, you can see here that it's just northwest of Bombay near central India. As mentioned earlier, knowledge of the Indian landscape was a critical part of the British mission in India at the time, and the role of professional draftsmen such as Gangaram Chintaman Tambad was significant, since sketching was a quick and economical method of recording primary material accurately. and drawings were used routinely as models for engravings, which were published to disseminate new information. In this case, Tambat was specifically commissioned by Wales and Mallet to record the cave temples, among other subjects. Making sketches that showed distinctly Indian architecture was a necessary tool for British expansion into India. However, the practice also served as a point of fascination for wealthy British people. The sketches served as an equivalent of modern-day tourism. Merchants wanted to bring back souvenirs, both for the pleasure derived from these foreign landscapes and for the purpose of education. An essential incentive for the creation of these works was their unique educational ability. Now, when we travel, we take pictures and show people back home, and we're impressed and mystified by architecture and art and landscapes that we've never seen before. This was, of course, even truer a few centuries ago, but of course they did not have their phones to take pictures, and the vast majority of Britons had no idea what India looked like, and this ultimately inspired this tremendous influx of Indian art, books, and other souvenirs. Pictures such as this were very attractive to British travelers for this reason. James Wales, the artist of the previous piece, and Mallet, who commissioned him, trained Gangram, a native Indian artist, in the Western techniques of perspective and shading, but his results appear strikingly different from theirs. Little is actually known of his background outside of his relations with James Wales and Charles War Mallet, who described him as ingenious. Though Gangram incorporated aspects of the picturesque Western perspective into his works, they seem to maintain key features of his regional training and his own artistic style. He drew upon established Indian artistic conventions as well as European techniques that he had picked up from Mallet and Wales to create a body of illustrations that became vital for scholarly research on Indian architecture.
Moving on to the third piece of art, which is another work focused on a singular building. This depicts an Islamic mosque rather than a Hindu temple. The first thing that stands out to me here is the sheer size of the entrance to the mosque. It almost makes you feel as if you are actually in the presence of a supreme being, which was, of course, the intention of the architects. This painting, by the uncle and nephew duo, Thomas and William Daniels, manipulates scale to communicate this. The trees, smaller buildings beside it, and comparatively tiny figures surrounding the mosque emphasize its grandeur. Looking closely at the people here, they seem to be dressed in traditional Indian clothing. They're clustered in small groups, either walking or sitting facing one another. It seems to be a quiet, peaceful scene. The precise details of the watercolor drawing in the individually painted bricks and sticks and leaves also stands out to me. We know that during their travels around India, the Daniels employed a camera obscura to produce detailed drawings. So a portable camera obscura, as it's shown here, is a box-like contraption with a pinhole and dark interiors. Light enters through the hole, creating an inverted image of the outside object. A mirror is used to make the picture right side up onto a sheet of paper, where the artist is able to trace an outline. Thomas and his nephew William seem to have worked together on both their field drawings and their finished watercolors, which makes it difficult to distinguish their individual contributions. They set out for India in 1784, where they found rich sources of material for the topographical artist, which is one that aims to depict places, buildings, and natural landscapes in a realistic and detailed manner. They drew this in November 1789. Their imposing watercolor of the mosque's main entrance is an example of the finished watercolors that they worked up from their Indian field drawings after their return to England. The specific medium used here is watercolor and graphite on thick, moderately textured cream wove paper. To place this in its geographical context, Jaunpur is a landlocked region in the northwest of India, close to its border with Nepal. Looking at this drawing as a whole, the artists depict the mosque from an unfamiliar angle, and at such a distance that it lacks a clear foreground, middle, and background. It seems to depart from the conventions of James Wales, who does seem to have a clear foreground, middle, and background in the first drawing we looked at. Instead, this image makes it seem like the Daniels were more aligned with Gangram's representational techniques. This work makes great use of the linear perspective and light watercolors, that it may even have been directly inspired by Gangaram, in an example of cross-cultural artistic exchange, perhaps.
Our final artwork is by the artist Balthasar Solvens, who in this image depicts both agricultural and industrial life. In the foreground, there is an expansive grass populated by people and some animals. There's a small brick structure in the very center of the painting, a man riding a horse, perhaps playing polo on the left side, and a group of people gathered around a structure in the bottom right-hand corner. It isn't obvious to the viewer what these structures might be, which adds to the intrigue curated by Solvens about the mystery of a foreign landscape. Each section of the canvas seems slightly disjointed from the others, with each scene occurring contemporaneously, but almost in isolation from the other. The agricultural activity of the foregrounded grass expanse contrasts the background's urban scene, filled with tall buildings and the masts of ships. Also, above the ships and buildings, the artist depicts a cloud of air pollution. There's a clear difference between the white, fluffy cloud high above the city, painted in the upper left corner, and the gray smog hovering at the tops of the buildings. This simple cloud alludes to a great transformation occurring in India at the time of this painting. Calcutta, a city on the east coast of India in the province of Bengal, might have been an early destination for steamboats, invented mere years before the creation of this work and essential in the industrialization of India. The encroaching, overcast sky might serve as a forewarning of the ways in which industrialization would change the country's indigenous landscape. And when we zoom into this painting, the distinct style of the artist becomes clear. He overlaps lines, creating shadows and dimension through a process called cross-hatching. The washed-out colors in this work might remind us of the color palette we saw before in the Daniel's drawing of the mosque. However, in this case, the colors were actually produced using an aquatint process. This technique produces results that resemble watercolors, but the process itself is different. It consists of exposing a copper plate to acid through a layer of melted granulated resin. The process is more technically complicated in terms of materials and specific training required, which distinguishes it from works created by any indigenous Indians. This piece is labeled A View of Calcutta. It is part of a wider collection of works by Flemish artist Balthasar Solvens called A Collection of 250 Colored Etchings Descriptive of the Manners, Customs, and Dresses of the Hindus. It was completed in the years 1798 and 1799, while Solvens was journeying through India. We chose to include his work in our tour to emphasize that not only British artists came to India, but also, as fascination with the region grew, it attracted artists from other parts of Europe, largely for the aesthetic appeal of the new landscape. Solvens spent most of his time in India, in Calcutta specifically, and his collection of etchings provide a rich portrait of India 200 years ago. These next images, which we won't discuss in detail, provide a small sample of his greater collection. In addition to depicting natural landscapes and urban environments such as these, he illustrated the people of Bengal in their occupations, festivals, and daily life. Interestingly, his collection of etchings were a financial failure because by contemporary European standards, were rather cruelly made and did not appeal to the picturesque view they preferred. Nevertheless, his portrayal of India constitutes an unrivaled visual account of the people of Bengal in the late 18th century. From a historical and social perspective, Solvens' work, with its accompanying descriptions, is a great ethnographic survey of life in Bengal. According to the Solvens Project at the University of Texas at Austin, quote, he gives his figures individual character and places them in time and space with narrative interests, and in doing so, he provides the viewer intimate access. This distinguishes him from having purely encyclopedic interest, for with artistic purpose, he combines the ethnographic and the aesthetic. He seeks to convey art as information. In conclusion, European artists' depictions of India in the late 1700s served multiple purposes, ranging from colonial expansion and cultural exoticism to commercial enterprise. These representations often played a significant role in shaping European perceptions of India during this period. As we mentioned, artists were often commissioned to create images that would promote colonial ventures, portraying India in a favorable light to encourage settlement, trade, and support for colonial administration. Of course, India also held a fascination for Europeans due to its perceived exoticism and the allure of its culture, landscapes, and people. European artists depicted India through a Western lens, emphasizing its perceived mysteries and cultural differences. These representations often reflected Western fantasies and stereotypes rather than actual accurate portrayals of Indian life, and even those that were flattering, established, and then perpetuated racial stereotypes. These artworks show both the beauty and the exploitation that occurred during this early cultural exchange between India and Europe, and how European art came to understand Indian landscapes, architecture, and customs in visual art in the late 1700s. Here is a list of the illustrations included in our presentation. Thank you so much for listening.